Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the October HATF webinar. My name is Haley Rivers, and I am the Kupu AmeriCorps member for the HATF, or if you didn't already know, the Hawaii Experimental Tropical Forest. And I am also the head coordinator for this webinar series. This webinar series exists so that the community can learn about the research that happens within the HATF, and so that our researchers have a chance to give back and share what they are passionate about. Thank you all for tuning into the webinar today. We are, as always, immensely grateful for your enthusiasm and your support. A few things before we start. This webinar is being recorded. It is going to be uploaded to a YouTube playlist, and after this is all done, you guys will get an email with a link to that YouTube playlist. And also keep an eye out for our next webinar in November. Once the webinar begins, you will be muted and video is disabled. Feel free to put any of your burning questions into the chat. They will be answered as part of the Q&A at the end of the presentation. However, if you would rather ask your question with your actual voice and face, then feel free to, once we're in the Q&A section, to unmute and turn your video on to ask any questions that way. At the end, we are also going to be sending out a feedback form. So please take a few minutes to fill that in because, you know, these webinars are as good as we can make them with feedback from you guys. So it's a joint effort. But with that, I would like to introduce Ian Ware, a postdoctoral research ecologist working for the U.S. Forest Service at the Institute of Pacific Islands Forestry. So it's all yours, Ian.
Thank you, Haley. I'm pumped to be here. As Haley said, my name is Ian. I am a ecosystem ecologist who's largely interested in questions about climate change and how climate change is altering the forests around the world that I've been associated with. Today, I'll be specifically talking to you about work within a long-term forest dynamic network here on Hawaii Island, and that started over a decade ago now, and I'm relatively new to the project, and this is kind of the first time I have been able to give this talk to the public. So I'm pretty excited to share what I've found so far. And a lot of this work that predates my work on the project, so it wouldn't be possible without a whole group of people. So I always like to start my talks by thanking everyone that came before me and all the people that helped out on this project with the Forest Service, different universities, and a long list of collaborators on this project, and many, many others that I don't really have time to list. So as many of us know, global change is altering ecosystems across the planet, across multiple species, across population communities, both in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. And global change, from climate change, habitat destruction, fire invasion, nitrogen deposition through acid rain, is shifting species ranges, so where these species live. And though it's altering where these species live, some species, like plant species that are longer lived, may not be able to kind of outpace climate change scenarios, and species range shifts aren't really a way for them to kind of respond to climate warming or drying per se. And so forests, for example, are experiencing these changes as well. And as you can see in this figure, this is just a map of China and how much productivity in forests across China have changed. And what you can see is that in some places in the blue, these certain forests under different models with the two different maps or two different models, you can actually see that there's an increase in growth and productivity, and then as you kind of get to the more warm colors, those tend to be reductions in overall productivity and growth. And so these changes in forests specifically can kind of have a wide variety of change. And forests are important for a large number of reasons. Forests host over 80% of the biodiversity on land, and they sustain a myriad of genetic resources that are very useful in science and science discovery. They also play an enormous role in terrestrial nutrient cycling and carbon balance. And this is kind of, I'll talk about this later, but this is very important in terms of feeding back into terms of altering potential future climates. And in addition, they provide food, fuel, and fiber. Forests clean the air, they clean the water we drink, they control floods and erosion, and even provide opportunities for cultural enrichment, employment, recreation, and education. And there have even been a large number of studies in psychology that have found that humans tend to be happier just being around and seeing trees on a regular basis. And I know I'm one of those people. And so the primary challenge for sustaining forests and forest management in the future is finding ways to continue to benefit from these ecological services without compromising the forest's ability to provide these services. And so that kind of goes hand in hand with the climatic changes that we're seeing across the globe. And so our understanding of how forests globally are responding to these fluctuations in climate are limited. And this constrains our effort to properly forecast what may be happening in the future and how we may be able to sustain forests in the future as well. So yeah, historic and contemporary climates, for example, have shaped and continue to influence the forests and the forest ecosystems that we see here in Hawaii and around the world. So when you walk around in a forest, past climates and contemporary climates are interacting to play a large role in the dynamics that we see with those forests, the traits that we see, the abundance of specific species, where specific species live, so their distribution, as well as kind of like I mentioned just a second ago, individual traits, so specific leaf shapes, photosynthetic capacity, and all of those kind of play into how fast trees grow and how productive they may be on the landscape. Climate can also influence mortality. So it can actually, trees and plants become heat stressed or drought stressed and actually not be able to kind of respond to climatic changes and actually can die. That's something that we obviously want to prevent. Climate change can also alter species interactions and these community level processes. And so, for example, drought can increase plant stress, and with neighboring plants could experience this increased competition, which I've kind of highlighted with these orangish yellowish arrows. And so as these interactions between local species start to kind of change or experience, or say a couple important species may die off in specific forests, this is going to have a large influence. Those cumulative impacts can have a large influence on how those ecosystems can function. And overall, can really alter the forest productivity and how forests function in the future on all those things I had mentioned on why forests are important. And something I should also mention here is that there's also growing evidence that not only ecological and evolutionary changes are happening in these natural systems in response to climate change, but that all of these changes that we are seeing are likely trait specific, so growth rate specific or photosynthetic capacity or phenology, for example, but that can also be very species specific. So kind of trying to understand these wide-ranging effects can have very pointed results for individual management implications. And so if we know which species or which traits are changing, we may be able to help mitigate any changes that are occurring on the landscape. And since forests are some of the most productive and diverse and carbon-rich ecosystems on Earth, they can have a disproportionately large influence over terrestrial biosphere atmosphere carbon exchange. And so we know that modern climate change is kind of largely driven by these increases in CO2 in our atmosphere. And then because plants and forests in general absorb a lot of that carbon, they store a lot of that carbon in their woody biomass, in their roots, in the soils that they inhabit. They can have a really strong influence and actually feed back to influence climatic patterns that we may see in the future. And so all these climatic driven patterns in plant productivity and plant mortality are central to global change and global change science because they can in turn influence the climates that the world is experiencing. So today I'll be largely focusing on the purple arrows here. which are how past climate and current climate patterns have influenced forest growth and the patterns that we see on the landscape. But it's important to note that while investigating one forest through time is obviously very powerful, and not many people have explored individual forests through time, there are these global networks that are starting to emerge where that have been established, to investigate how forests change through time in an effort to understand how forests function, and as well as how they are responding to these climatic changes scenarios. And so the point I wanted to make here is that forests across the globe are going to respond differently. And they're going to respond differently because they occur in different biomes, for example. They have different species that occur within those biomes. They have different soils that they inhabit, and so on. And so kind of getting these broad examples where we have measured forest productivity or mortality and demography through time are going to be really important for how we may be able to predict forest change in the future. So what about Hawaiian forests? So as many as you know, probably, Hawaiian forests are highly endemic, which means that most of the species that occur here only occur on the Hawaiian Islands. There's a relatively low species diversity in comparison to other tropical forests like the Amazon, for example. But since the spatial patterns of rainfall in Hawaii are some of the most diverse in the world, the forest here can vary dramatically. As most of you know from driving back and forth from the east and west sides of the island, these ecosystems are extremely different. And unfortunately, Hawaii, not unlike the rest of the world, is experiencing climate change. Over 90% of the state is experiencing drying trends. And as you can look at this figure, all of the areas in red and the warmer colors are areas that have experienced decreases in rainfall over the last, or per decade over the last, I think the study was about 100 years. And so as you can see, most of Hawaii Island, right, is pretty red or yellow. So there has been a relatively large decrease in the amount of total rainfall that we're experiencing here, with some of the largest decreases on the western side of the island. We are also experiencing changes in temperature. And as you can tell by the red line, the red lines, which are significant trends in those specific variables, and these are all temperature variables. So that panel A is temperature mean, B is the minimum temperature experienced each day, and then temperature max is a maximum temperature. And then the DTR, all that is a daily temperature range. And so that's how much range in temperature we see within a day. So pretty much from nighttime to the warmest part of the day. And so we're actually seeing that, if you look at panel A, that temperatures are increasing as we get, as you come closer to the present. And this trend has continued past 2016, with some of the last couple of years being some of the warmest temperatures on record here. And so to investigate how Hawaiian forests specifically are responding to this change in climate over the last decade, the Hawaii Permanent Plot Network was established with the vision of becoming a climate vegetation observatory for building capacity to understand and conserve and manage Hawaiian forest ecosystems in a rapidly changing world. HIPPNET, as it is called, is comprised of a number of institutions, as well as a member of the Forest Global Earth Observatory, this is large global network of forest dynamic plots that that are set up all in a similar way and all measure plants in a very similar way. So we can compare all of those effects through time as well as across the globe. And as I mentioned, I guess I didn't mention, this is a kind of a multi-institution collaboration between the Forest Service, both universities, Hawaii, Hilo, and Manoa, as well as UCLA and HEDF here. And so to show you where these plots occur, here's a map of the Big Island with the 4 plots that are part of HIPPNET. Lapahoehoe was our first plot, and it was established in 2008 on the windward side of the island. Palamanui was the second plot established in 2009. And so those plots have been established for over 10 years now. Mamalahoa, also on the western side of the island, was established in 2011, and then Puvava, our fourth site, was established in 2013. And each of these four sites are quite different and represent kind of four individual observational experiments, if you will, to understand how climate change in those plots, or excuse me, climate variation in those plots over time has altered the forest dynamics that we see both in growth and plant mortality, for example. Mamalahoa is a 1 hectare plot, which is about 2.5 acres. Relatively low elevation. It is one of our drier sites, and soil ages tend to be on the younger side for our island. There's only 4 species in this plot, and only 77 trees when it was last measured, and it's dominated mainly by ohia. Palamanui is also a lowland dry forest. It's one of our 4 hectare plots, which is almost 10 acres. It experiences very little rainfall and has a very distinct dry season. It's on the same soil age. And as you can see, since it's a bigger plot, it's a lot more dense. It's a much denser forest with about 15 species and over 12,000 individual trees the last time it was censused. With the main, the 2 dominant species being Diospyros sandracensis and Sidrax odoratum. Puvava is our montane mesic forest, which means it kind of has drier and wetter. It's wetter, but it also has dry portions of the season. It's up on the Puvava, up in Puvava. It has 14 species, almost 700 trees, and is dominated by ohia and koas. And our last 4 hectare plot is Lapahoihoi. It's a montane wet forest, also a 4 hectare plot, a little bit higher in elevation with exponentially more rain than the others, and tends to be, it is on the older end of the soil age gradient on the island, with recent work showing that the soils here are about 20,000 years old. There are 21 species in this plot and almost 13,000 individuals last time that was censused, and the two dominant species here, with Chireodendron being a understory and then ohia being a dominant overstory. And so what do we do in these plots? So over the last 10 years, we've repeatedly censused these plots on a relatively regular basis from year to year. We measure all standing trees above that are greater than 1 centimeter, and we measure the annual growth increments by measuring the DBH, and that's the diameter of a tree at breast height. So we measure each tree that's standing, what it's growing in, if it's leaning. We also measure mortality and recruitment. So we measure new trees that come into the plot that are big enough to be measured, and we measure which trees have died throughout the census. And so this gives us a good idea of how every individual species within the plot is growing, as well as how different species are, the patterns of mortality within each species and at the plot level. So we can have a good understanding of individual species level changes, as well as forest-wide forest level inference on how they're growing and the changes that are occurring within. Each plot has its own weather station, and at those weather stations, we are measuring temperature, rainfall, relative humidity, short and long wave solar radiation from the sun, wind speed, and soil moisture. And this is getting measured every 10 minutes and is communicated via the internet signal and downloaded to a computer daily. And then we do all sorts of things to make sure that we can use it and keep that data very useful and cleaned up. So we have this really nicely paired high resolution climate data to match with really high level stand measurements to understand how variation from year to year in both forest dynamics, so how the growth and death rates within forests, as well as change within individual climatic variables, and how those things may interact on the landscape. To understand how these forests are changing as the climates around them that they occur in are changing as well. And so the first slide I'm going to show you here is just the interannual variation in growth and mortality. Time is on the bottom, so the x-axis there, time point. and then the individual measurements or the average measurements of annual growth on the y-axis and mortality on the second panel there. And as you can see, there's kind of some wiggle from year to year, some different trends that may emerge as you kind of go up and down and wiggle in response to just time kind of passing by. So we see, and just to clarify here too, that with 6 being, the time point 6 is the most recent time. So I believe that was in 2017, was the most recent time point there. And so as the colors get warmer, it's a more recent measurement. We also see kind of some variation in mortality as well. So knowing that things are kind of moving around would suggest that there are some there's environmental variation that may be influencing the patterns, and so the amount of kind of wiggle and variation that we see in these lines. And in a similar fashion, here is kind of the patterns we're seeing in climate. And so the first panel on the top left is kind of a standardized mean temperature. And so what these measurements mean here is just a deviation from the mean. So if it's above the dotted line, it's kind of a positive increase. So it's greater than the mean. If it's negative, it's lower on it than on average. And so you can kind of see where within the census you kind of have higher temperature, higher rainfall, or higher minimum temperatures and higher maximum temperatures. Just kind of get an idea of how these climates are trending. And so as you can kind of just see in the temperature, it kind of bounces back and forth. Falapahoihoi, Mamalahoa seems to be kind of getting warmer from year to year. Palamanui bouncing back and forth, and so on. And so this kind of provides an idea that climates are also shifting. And it's important to know that kind of in the beginning of this census, as you can kind of see in the second panel for mean daily rainfall, Hawaii was kind of coming out of a pretty severe drought. And you can kind of see that kind of trending from being kind of below average in rain to above average in rain there. And so since we have interannual variation in growth and mortality, as well as some significant variation in climate, we would suspect that those two are likely interacting to influence the patterns that we may see on the landscape. And just to walk you through the next two figures are going to kind of look like this. And so what I did, instead of looking at individual climatic variables, I squished all of those climatic variables into this composite. So for instance, we don't experience just temperature. We experience the interaction between temperature and relative humidity and rainfall and radiation, right? So what I did here to try to understand how climate just in general is related to these interannual variation patterns and interannual growth, excuse me, I kind of created these little PC axes. So that the bottom axis there, the climate composite axis, is just the smushed variation of all of the climate that we see across all 4 plots. Again, the colored dots are going to be different time points through time, with the 6th time point and the warmer colors being more recent. And then the different shapes, square, circle, plus sign, are going to be different symbols for the different plots. And before I move the climate composite, just in general, based on how it kind of falls along this hotter, drier, cooler, wetter spectrum, with a couple other things playing in, but it's mainly dominated by temperature and precipitation. Excuse me. And we do see a trend in growth. So since it's through time, what this says is that there's at least climatic structure between plots through time and growth. With kind of Palamanui, the squares here, and the triangles, Mamalahoa kind of being on the drier side, and then Palamanui, these 2 circles here, and Laupohoihoi being, I guess, the triangles, or plus sign, sorry. And then Laupohoihoi kind of being over here on this side. And so what kind of all this really says is that hotter and drier forests are likely going to have different growth than cooler and wetter forests on average. I did a similar thing here too. So there was another climatic composite that was more significant for mortality. And this composite variable kind of tended to be a little bit more on this a slightly harder continuum to understand, but it kind of has to do with sunlight and wetness. And so it's not as straightforward as the other one, kind of being a hotter, wetter, cooler, drier, cooler, wetter, hotter, drier spectrum, but kind of has this interactive effect of solar radiation, with that meaning there's just a lot more a lot more sunlight in those plots with a towards the middle and left side of this composite. And we see a similar pattern that, you know, when there's high sun, but there also tends to be periods of wetness, you have relatively low mortality. And as you kind of start to get higher in that intermediate rate solar radiation, but drier, you kind of start to see an uptick in mortality. And then cooler and wetter, lower solar radiation, wetter, there tends to be higher rates of mortality. And there are likely a large number of things that kind of probably play into the trade-off in mortality and climate here that I won't get into today, but I'm happy to answer questions about. So in general, and on average, annual mortality and annual growth are related to kind of these large climatic composites that we see across Hawaii Island. And kind of as I mentioned before, this past climatic effects. So climates from previous time points, so all these antecedent climate conditions can interact to influence patterns of forest growth. And there have been a large number of studies that have found that plant growth responses to past climate can have a temporal lag. And so this happens when previous climatic conditions can be more important, per se, than more recent patterns in climate. And the effects of those climate may not be apparent until years later or months later. And kind of explaining any patterns or differences that we may see on the landscape. So maybe there was a large drought or something, or an extended period of time with relatively low rainfall. I mean, you might not see, you know, that may stress trees out, and it might take a little while before those stress trees to potentially either become dead trees or have a reduction in the amount of growth that they experience. And so to understand how these kind of past windows in time influence patterns of growth, we performed what's called climatic window analysis. And that allowed us to do two separate things. First, it allowed us to just identify key climatic variables for each plot and for each species of interest. And so what that means is it allowed us to just ask, what's the most important climatic factor? And so I showed you in the previous slides that kind of climate writ large is important for patterns that we were seeing on the landscape. Well, this will allow us to say, is it maximum temperature? Is it rainfall? What's the main driver for individual species and individual sites? And second, this analysis will allow us to identify past windows in time for that individual key climatic variable that best explains the patterns in growth for each plot and for each species of interest. So it'll allow us to kind of understand, was it this window in temperature 6 to 8 months ago that was really that really explains the patterns in growth that we saw later on. And so since we have these these interannual, these yearly repeated averages of growth, we should be able to get a kind of an initial understanding of what are the individual climatic variables and how and when, what time frame are they influencing growth of these dominant species within our plots. And so I'll start with our montane wet forest. And so I have it circled here again. I showed you this picture earlier on. And so for Lapuhoihoi, what are the key climatic predictors and climate lags that we found? So at the site level, we found that total rainfall about 10 to 11 months ago was really important in explaining the patterns and growth that we saw from a year-to-year basis. And this isn't incredibly surprising. Lapuhoihoi has has the most rainfall by far. So if we see deviations in that rainfall, say maybe there's a drier pattern drier period, it could have a large effect. And we're still trying to tease out what about 10 to 11 months ago, what characteristics about that time frame were most important. But in general, we kind of have this 10 to 11 month window in the past that is important for explaining the patterns of growth that we see at each census, at each time point as we move forward in time and closer to the present. And then for the most dominant species, so for Alapa, we see that total rainfall was also, again, a key climatic predictor, but we see a 5 to 6 month window there. So it's a little shorter window in time. And I can't really speak to what that difference may mean at this moment. And we see that but in different, but Ohia is kind of responding to the 7 months prior in mean annual or mean maximum temperature. So what that means is these daily maximums are getting potentially higher and could have a relatively large effect on the growth patterns that we see. And in this specific example, mean maximum temperatures were actually increasing. And there was kind of a hump-shaped distribution. So as it got to a certain point in the mean maximum temperature, we were actually seeing increases in growth. But after a certain point of it kind of continuing to go up, we started to see decreases in growth. So as kind of mean maximum temperatures continue to climb, that could suggest that that's relatively detrimental for Ohia on the landscape. And Koa as well kind of showed a similar pattern as Ohia, with mean temperature here, just kind of mean overall temperature for the day, with a climate lag from 0 to 8 months in the past. And like I said, it showed a similar pattern where up to a certain point, we kind of see this kind of hump-shaped relationship with it, but once it gets kind of to a certain threshold, growth starts to decrease. So again, suggesting that as temperatures continue to climb, we may see this be detrimental to the growth patterns that we see for Koa on the landscape. Next, I wanted to show Palamanui, since it's our other 4-hectare plot where the results are extremely robust. This is our lowland dry forest, again, just to remind you. And unsurprisingly, we are on the opposite end of the rainfall gradient on Hawaii Island. And we see that total rainfall, again, is kind of the main dominant predictor at the forest level. So that's including, again, all plants and all species. And the climate lag there seems to be 0 to 4 months. And I think that this is important for at least one reason, is that the rainfall here is a lot more seasonable, and it kind of comes in big events, and there is a dramatic dry season. And so it's the rainfall that has occurred more closely to our growth estimates is likely is explaining the most variation here. And so it's a pretty sensitive, I assume that Palamanui is pretty sensitive to any rainfall it gets. For Alahee, we see that rainfall again in 0 to 4 months seems to be kind of the same window, matching the site predictions that we saw. And then Ali'i, we see the key climatic factor here was mean maximum temperature, and then kind of having the climate lag of 1 to 7 months. And again, on this one, we saw a similar hump-shaped pattern where growth was increasing to a certain point for these mean maximum temperatures, and it then again began to tail off and start decreasing as mean maximum temperatures continued to increase. And so as we start to kind of get these individual estimations of specific climate lags and which climatic predictor is the most important, we'll really be able to kind of understand and tease apart individual species level responses and how we may be able to help mitigate or manage these responses in the future. And so kind of being able to tease out specific variables will be very important in terms of forest management. At the moment, I'm not going to show the Mamalahoa and Puvava sites because we're just now getting that analysis online, since there's a couple fewer time points and they're not quite as robust at the moment. Okay, so in summary, the three main bullet points I want you guys to take home as important findings is that we see climate is influencing the patterns of growth and mortality that we see across the 4 Hawaiian forest sites. And the key climatic variables explaining patterns in growth vary by plot and by species. And so we're starting to get a really a more detailed picture of how individual forests are responding, as well as individual species within those plots. And it's important to note that climate lags are also varying by plot and by species. And so this allows us to maybe identify which species are more sensitive to more short-term patterns of short-term changes in climate, to maybe start identifying species that we probably need to be focusing on in terms of management. And I think probably the most important finding that I didn't lay out here was that we've kind of established a baseline. And so in our first 10 years of data, essentially, that I presented today, it really provides us with, kind of this initial initial look into how climate variation is influencing these interannual patterns and growth that we're seeing. And so as we can kind of establish a baseline, the next 10 to 20 years of data that will come after this, it will really help us show, kind of really establish how forest, these ecological trajectories in the future may be changing. And it'll allow us to kind of increase our ability to predict those changes. And notice that any changes that we do see are related to the climatic change that we're seeing on the landscape. And then there's two major take-home messages that I'd like to share. Long-term censusing like this is important. It's cost-heavy, it's time-heavy, there's a lot of people that are involved, but it really provides extremely unique, extremely useful information for untangling how forests will respond to climate change. And it's extremely needed as we move into the future. And these continued efforts are pivotal if we are to kind of extremely accurately and efficiently manage for forest resiliency, in hopes to kind of help mitigate any negative effects of altering terrestrial carbon balance. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to take them now, or you can reach out to me via my email or on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Ian. That was awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, at the moment, I don't think we have any questions in the chat, but this is you guys' time. If you want to unmute to ask questions, you can unmute, turn your video on, do all of that, or feel free to type them in the chat. Oh, so Karen asked, thank you for the great information. Is this presentation available to share later? Yes. Oh, wait. We are going to upload the recording of this to YouTube afterwards, and you guys should get the link to the YouTube playlist at the end of the presentation. All right, Phil Hester has a question. Phil asks, are soil types and nutrition taken into consideration?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually speaks to a lot of the stuff that I did prior to coming to Hawaii. I am trying to add some resolution below ground. I've collected soils to kind of look at carbon-nitrogen ratios, as well as microbial communities within these forests, to understand if we can account for the variation and how microbes may influence plant traits and plant growth, as well as the nutrient availability. Off the bat, I didn't see any differences in growth patterns as we kind of took soil substrate age, which tends to be a pretty good indicator of kind of soil productivity. So off the bat, no, but there are a lot of studies within the within the wet side. We have a lot of really good resolution in both the Palamanui and Lapahoihoi sites of some past studies that have some pretty cool soil data. So that stuff's gonna be coming. I'm extremely interested in trying to understand how soil variation plays into this as well, because it's a much slower pool and will be affected through climate as well. So kind of understanding plant soil dynamics is incredibly important in the future. Great question.
Awesome. We have more questions in the chat now. So Katie asks, thank you for this info. What sorts of management strategies might be developed based on this data?
Kind of as I mentioned, it allows us to, at least in the short term, it allows us to kind of flag individual species that may be experiencing above average mortality. And so after large droughts or large heat waves, we can go into the data and understand how many individuals have died. We haven't specifically seen large patterns of die-off, but those are happening across the world. And so as we kind of start to dig into this data set and look for more nuanced patterns in mortality, that'll kind of identify really important species to kind of focus on to see if there's anything that we can do to mitigate that. And in other systems, there's been great success kind of outplanting and replanting individuals. And I know that they're doing that with ohia in response to rod. So yeah, so it allows us to kind of identify individual species, which would be a really unique management tool to be able to go in, identify a species that is of concern, continue to monitor that species, but maybe take some specific steps to help mitigate any changes that we need to fix. I hope that answered the question.
All right, we have one more question in the chat. Karen asks, are you storing the tree information where it's available to the public and for volunteers to continue collecting data? And have you heard of Nature's Notebook USDA?
I haven't heard of Nature's Notebook, but the data used, so this data is actually getting used into multiple manuscripts at the moment. And the individual data set that's been used up to now will be published online. And what's really unique about the Forest Geo Network that I mentioned that HIPPNET is a part of is you can go into their database, you can communicate with all the scientists that run those databases for all the forests across the globe, from across Asia, Africa, North America, Europe, South America. There's plots all over. And you can ask those scientists for their data. You have to kind of get approval through that scenario. We operate the same way. We kind of operate under the same guidelines that Forest Geo does, since we're part of their global network. And you can kind of ask to use that data. And then if you wanted to write up your own paper, if you wanted to study it in your own way, which is really cool about this data set and other data sets like it in Forest Geo. And as far as remeasuring, we are still collecting data. So the censusing is ongoing. We've almost finished up the most recent census that wasn't included in this talk. And then we'll, after we kind of get this finished up and polished, it'll probably be about time to start heading out and recensusing that. And so I know that HIPPNET hires field crews every year and a half. So obviously look out for those field crew advertisements if that's something you're interested in. But yeah, other than that, it's usually a pretty training heavy introduction to measuring these forests and being part of the HIPPNET team.
All right, we have another question.
Great.
Phil asks, are you also using tree ring data to expand timelines for your data?
It's a great question. We are not. I know folks have in the past, and they are an extremely useful database for understanding fluctuations. Exactly what I've kind of walked through today, trying to understand the relationship between growth increment and climatic change, especially drought. We aren't using tree ring data. A lot of people are. The one thing about tree ring data is you have to cut a tree down or core it to look at it, and we're not really open to coring because it can sometimes lead to especially with things like rod, it can really lead to fungal infection and mortality. And so we don't want to be altering anything within our plots, but plenty of folks that have kind of cut down old trees in previous studies across the globe have shown these really tight correlations. And so these tree ring increments, so like measuring the outside of this tree really kind of gets it similar variation that would be kind of understood within tree ring data. But since we're measuring it through time, we kind of pick up on big growth increments, small growth increments that kind of you would see once you cut a tree and looked at the rings within them. So this is a little bit less invasive and allows us to continue the study on that individual tree without potentially harming it in the future.
Awesome. There aren't any more questions in the chat, but if you guys have any more questions, we'll still be here for a few minutes. So feel free to unmute or type a bunch. Okay. It seems like we probably aren't going, oh, okay. Chuck says, very interesting, looking forward to future results, mahalo. But it seems like, you know, all of the questions have been asked, and so that means it is time for our seminar to begin drawing to a close. After the seminar, you guys are going to get an email, and that information will have the feedback form. Please fill it out and tell us, you know, how we can improve these. It will also have the link to the YouTube playlist. This recording will hopefully be there by the end of the week. And it will also have a link to the Eventbrite to sign up for November's webinar. That being said, thank you so much, Ian. This was really cool.
Yeah, thank you.
It's always good to hear about what HIPPNET is up to. Very important work. And with that, it's time to sign off. Thank you all for tuning in.
Thanks, everybody.